Josephine Lyon was born February 8, 1844, which correlates with the conception date around May 18, 1843, if she were delivered at full term. Up until today, Sylvia Sessions Lyon Clark was known to be the mother, but the paternity was uncertain. Ugo Perigo's painstaking analysis of the DNA data documents that Sylvia experienced sexual relations with Windsor at that time. This data and some other new evidences can be interpreted in at least 4 different ways. I am going to briefly introduce them along with their respective documentation. One interpretation is that the evidence supports that Sylvia was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity only, and Windsor was the only genuine husband Sylvia had in Nauvoo. In 1915, Josephine related that shortly before her 1882 death, her mother, Sylvia, called Josephine to her side, and she told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith. Generally, this language would be interpreted to mean physical paternity. However, according to the teachings of the times, if Sylvia was sealed in marriage to Joseph, then all of Sylvia's children, regardless of their biological fathers, would be his in eternity. Thereafter, referring to them as sons and daughters of the prophet would have been consistent with those doctrines. For example, Sylvia later bore a child, Phoebe, to her last husband, Ezekiel Clark. According to a statement in the Clark family record, Phoebe Clark, a half-sister to Josephine, was also present at Sylvia's bedside when she uttered her declaration that Josephine was Joseph's daughter. The record indicates that Phoebe believed the declaration applied equally to her and was not a reference to genetic relations. For this and other reasons, several researchers have written that the language is too ambiguous to draw strict conclusions. Social scientist Rex E. Cooper declared, "I find the evidence to be less convincing." Other scholars have agreed. Additional supportive evidence comes from a letter from Joseph Smith III to RLDS leader E.C. Brand in 1894. She, Sylvia, may have been sealed, but her testimony to E.C. Briggs gives the case away as to children by Joseph Smith. If my memory serves me right, she was childless in Nauvoo. President Smith then added, "Mountainous air and some vigorous proxy may have done for Joseph what he did not do for himself," meaning he had no children with Sylvia physically. Less the enjoyment, of course, which might be a reference to sexuality. Bah. I have not been able to locate any notes from an interview between E.C. Briggs and Sylvia Sessions, but Joseph Smith III concluded that Sylvia's comments excluded the possibility of any children being born as a result of her relationship with the prophet. Contradicting this view are rumors that can now be labeled definitively false. Included is an 1888 entry in George Brimhall's journal that reads, "Went to Spanish Fork. Evening had a talk with Father Hales, who told me that it was said that Joseph Smith had a daughter named Josephine living in Bountiful, Utah. At that time, Josephine Lyon lived in Bountiful with her husband, John Fisher." Similarly, stake president Angus Cannon told Joseph Smith III in 1905, "I will now refer to you one case where it is said by the girl's grandmother that your father, Joseph Smith the prophet, has a daughter born of a plural wife. The girl's grandmother was Mother Sessions, who lived in Nauvoo and died here in the valley. She was the granddaughter of Mother Sessions. That girl, I believe, is living today in Bountiful, north of this city." One view is that Sylvia realized after Windsor was excommunicated that she could not be sealed to him, and so she approached Joseph, like Ruth Vos Sayers approached Joseph because her husband was not a member, and was sealed to Joseph for eternity. The source of the rumors would have been someone else, perhaps Patty, Josephine's grandmother, who was simply misinformed. A second interpretation of Ugo Perigo's finding is that Sylvia practiced polyandry, or a plurality of husbands, with both Joseph and Windsor, but Windsor was absent for several weeks after he had impregnated her, leaving her to cohabit exclusively with Joseph until Windsor's return, creating Sylvia's belief that Joseph was the father. Catherine Danes explains, "If Sylvia Sessions knew that Josephine Lyon Fisher was Joseph's biological child, she could have been having sexual relations only with Smith, not with Windsor Lyon. she could be certain of her child's paternity only if she restricted her sexual relations to one husband at a time. If Sylvia had told Josephine that her father could have been either Joseph or Windsor, then it would be plain evidence that she was referring to biological parentage and was practicing polyandry. But that is not what she reportedly told Josephine. Her declaration, if referring to physical paternity, could only support an exclusive relationship with Joseph Smith for the period of time immediately after becoming pregnant by Windsor. Is it possible for a woman to be pregnant and not know it? The answer is yes. About 20% of women experience no morning sickness. Others feel mild symptoms and may believe they are simply a little under the weather. Many other pregnancy symptoms are either too mild, too general, or too short-lived to give a strong clue. Abdominal expansion isn't noticeable until 8 to 12 weeks. A woman with an irregular or long cycle and who occasionally misses a period might not be suspect until she were 2 months pregnant. About a quarter of women experience spotting during early pregnancy, usually between the 5th and 8th weeks of pregnancy, which could be interpreted as a late period. Fetal movement is not detected until well after 12 weeks. Supporting this theory is a statement from John C. Bennett's 6th letter to the Sangamo Journal printed August 19, 1842, sometimes called the Happiness Letter, and contains a text apparently dictated by Joseph Smith that states, "That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another." The context is plurality of wives, not a plurality of husbands. It is unknown if that principle could also apply to polyandry. John D. Lee, who is not always reliable, recalled a statement attributed to Brigham Young that might also apply. After the death of Joseph, Brigham Young told me that Joseph's time on earth was short and that the Lord allowed him privileges that we could not have. Some observers have suggested that polyandry may have been among the privileges reportedly given to Joseph. A variation on the polyandry possibility was brought to my attention when discussing the evidence with obstetrician colleagues who pointed out that if a woman is having relations with 2 men and gets pregnant, she will generally identify the more desirable male as the father, even if chances are equal for both. Another supporting observation is the chronology. If Sylvia was impregnated by Windsor, but at the child's birth believed Joseph was the actual father, then the span of time between her sexual relations with both men would have been days or weeks, at the most a month or 2. The easiest way to explain such a timeline is by assuming the relationships were polyandrous. This interpretation has been popular for decades. Multiple authors have observed that several of Joseph's plural wives experienced 2 marriage ceremonies, one legal and one religious. And then they advanced the theory of polyandry uncritically, without expressing any apparent skepticism or acknowledging a need for additional scrutiny. They do not ask or attempt to answer important questions like, what did the women believe regarding the validity of both marriages after the second ceremony? Or, why is there no evidence from any of these women or other Nauvoo polygamy insiders reflecting the belief that a woman could have 2 husbands at the same time? Reports of polyandry in Nauvoo appear to describe a controversial behavior that is without context. Some observers may assume that a plurality of wives creates a context for a plurality of husbands, but from a social and religious standpoint, it appears to be a logical fallacy. For example, in Islam, Muslim men are allowed to practice polygyny with up to a total of 4 wives, but polyandry is not permitted. In Judaism, polygyny was permitted in levirate marriages, yet the practice of polyandry is condemned. Hindus have allowed plurality of wives according to their caste system, but polyandry is not permitted. In Christianity, polygamy is acknowledged as an Old Testament practice but disallowed today. And Paul condemns polyandry in unambiguous terms, see Romans 7, 2 and 3. Similarly, within the early LDS Church, both leaders and members denounced polyandry. Brigham Young declared, polyandry is not known to the law. Orson Pratt taught, God has strictly forbidden in this Bible plurality of husbands and proclaimed against it in his law. Nauvoo polygamist Bathsheba Smith was asked, would it be a violation of the laws of the church for one woman to have two husbands living at the same time? And she responded, I think it would. Another Nauvoo pluralist, Belinda Martin Pratt, wrote in 1854, God has never commanded or sanctioned a plurality of husbands. Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, seems to teach the same thing. If any man espouse a virgin, and if one, after she is espoused, shall be with another man, she has committed adultery and shall be destroyed. Verses 61 through 63. Joseph introduced a plurality of wives as a religious practice. While all of the major religions of the day acknowledged it might be acceptable, they universally condemned polyandry. Also, an 1891 article in the magazine Popular Science Monthly on polyandry explained it is inconceivable that men should have voluntarily initiated polyandry, even if, by doing violence to our common sense, we suppose such a thing to be possible on the part of the men. How would the women submit? These observations do not mean that Joseph Smith could not have introduced and practiced polyandry, but they seem to generate valid questions of how he might have convinced devout believers into accepting such a novel sexual practice. We might imagine a man in Nauvoo seducing a married woman for a tryst, yet these relationships started with a ceremony that was viewed by witnesses and was known to other church members, while late and distant voices declare that these sealings authorized polyandry. Ironically, none of the participants left any statements supporting that view. Josephine's report of Sylvia's statement might be interpreted to corroborate Joseph Smith's practice of polyandry, but it would be ambiguous evidence. This ambiguity is found in virtually all supportive documents advanced by polyandry proponents. Returning now to Ugo's genetic data, a third interpretation is that shortly after becoming pregnant by Windsor, she separated from him, being sealed to Joseph Smith and experiencing conjugal relations only with him, the marriage being for time and eternity, not eternity only. I have been soundly criticized for suggesting that in the 1840s, legal marriages might be annulled by church leaders in the equivalence of a frontier divorce, where all parties ignore the civil union and consider themselves free to remarry. This dynamic was not rare and was likely the most common form of divorce in America for the first several decades of its existence. It occurred in the church as early as 1835 when Lydia Goldthwaite Bailey married Newell Knight. She was not legally divorced from Calvin Bailey, whom she had legally married 3 years earlier. Yet after the priesthood marriage by Joseph Smith, Lydia did not consider herself to have two husbands. Neither did the church or other authorities. Several documents support that Sylvia and Windsor formally separated in what might have been the equivalence of a frontier divorce. The 1915 affidavit clarifies the reason Sylvia was able to be sealed to Joseph. She told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith, she having been sealed to the prophet at the time her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. Of course, Sylvia could not be sealed to a living person who was not a member of the church. Yet, if polyandry were permitted as a religious practice, Windsor's loss of membership might have prevented his participation. What is helpful is that the reported wording provides a timeline for the sealing and indicates consecutive relationships, not simultaneous ones. A second manuscript in Andrew Jensen's file, written in the 1886-1887 period, identifies Sylvia as a plural wife who was formerly the wife of Windsor Lyon. A third document from Jensen states that Sylvia was married to Mr. Lyons. When he left the church, she was sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith. These statements might be dismissed as cover-up, but in the latter part of 1843 and in 1844, Sylvia and Windsor Lyon are not mentioned as being specifically together in Nauvoo. For example, when Emily Partridge was dismissed from the Nauvoo mansion by Emma, probably late 1843, she related, "My sister Eliza found a home with the family of brother Joseph Coolidge, and I went to live with sister Sylvia Lyons." The language that she did not go to live with the family of brother Lyons, but instead went to live with sister Sylvia Lyons, is consistent with a separation, but is not conclusive. A fourth interpretation of Ugo Perigo's genetic study involves the possibility that Sylvia did not understand the restrictions of her time and eternity sealing to Joseph, or she violated the covenant. Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verse 52, given July 12, 1843, tells Emma, "And let my handmaid Emma Smith receive all those who have been given unto my servant Joseph, and who are virtuous and pure before me. And those who are not pure, and have said they were pure, shall be destroyed, saith the Lord God." This language supports that Emma was not just concerned about polygamy, but that she may have also had specific concerns about the purity of one or more of Joseph's plural wives. If Sylvia was sealed to Joseph for time and eternity, but experiencing sexuality with Windsor, she would be guilty of adultery according to the revelation. There is little evidence to support that Sylvia was the woman whose purity Emma was concerned about, but in his letter to E.C. Brand, Joseph Smith III recalled, "There was a scandal about Mrs. Lyons while yet in Nauvoo, but on inquiry was either fruitless of results or it was hushed up, whitewashed. But she was then a married woman." Young Joseph would have been 11 in 1843, sufficiently old to remember important details. On April 20th, 1885, Joseph Smith III also interviewed James Whitehead, who had become an assistant secretary to the prophet in June 1842. In that interview, Whitehead referred to a Mrs. Lyon who was found in bed with S. Markham, who could have been Stephen Markham. There were other Mrs. Lyons in Nauvoo at the time, but Sylvia would have been on the list. Had Windsor not been identified through DNA testing as Josephine's physical father, one researcher had suggested testing for Markham. In review, this data seems to reliably identify Windsor Lyon as the father of Josephine Lyon, who was conceived approximately May 18, 1843. Unfortunately, much of the available evidences are contradictory, incomplete, or ambiguous. Observers' conclusions regarding this potential marital triangle will depend primarily on which documents they are willing to dismiss and which assumptions they are willing to embrace. Those possible conclusions include, first, Joseph's sealing to Sylvia Sessions was non-sexual eternity only, and evidence of sexuality between them did not originate with Sylvia. Second, Sylvia practiced polyandry with Windsor and Joseph, who was either a deceiving libertine, a fallen prophet, or a privileged seer who was allowed by God to experience both a plurality of wives and a plurality of husbands. This theory could benefit from a critical historical analysis. Third, shortly after becoming pregnant by Windsor, Sylvia separated from him and was sealed to Joseph in a time and eternity sealing and experienced conjugality with him. Fourth, Sylvia was sealed to Joseph but had sexual relations with Windsor either due to sin or misunderstanding. Other explanations may be possible, but it seems less likely that the relationship between Sylvia, Windsor, and Joseph can be fully discerned without additional historical information.